So, Final Fantasy VII. That's a game people seem to like. In fact, it's probably safe to say it's the most popular game in the entire series. Final Fantasy VIII was better! Shh, no, it wasn't. Look, people are going to argue which FF was the best ever until the end of time, and they'll probably argue even longer and louder over which game ruined the series forever. But let's at least agree at this point in time that 7 is the most recognizable entry among the mainstream audience and the most unanimously beloved by hardcore fans. No! Great, moving on. And speaking of the fans, I'm sure most of them could list off some of the key members in Square's development team that helped shape the game into the revolutionary RPG it became. You've got Kitase as the director, Sakaguchi as producer, Nomura as the character designer. These are the names that are typically familiar among the fans. But there's one name among the collaborators that I rarely see come up, to the point that I'm starting to think that not too many people are even aware of who he is or what role he had to play in the game's development. Masato Kato, who is listed under the special thanks section of the endgame credits, was a writer and story planner for Square at the time, who prior to FF7 worked on games released on the Super NES, including just one of the most celebrated RPGs of all time. Kato would continue to work on several games following FF7 on the written and conceptual capacity, including Xenogears, Chrono Cross, and Final Fantasy XI. That is an impressive resume, and it only gets more impressive the further back we go. Prior to his stint at Square, Kato had worked with Tecmo during the 8-bit NES era on Ninja Gaiden, as well as its 2 sequels. Yeah, I bet some of you just sat up in surprise. As a former NES kid myself, I still hold a great fondness for the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy, and I especially remember how floored I was the first time I saw the cinematic cutscenes. Up to that point, no console game had ever done anything even close to that level of presentation, and it really set the standard for story-driven visuals in video games. That sounds familiar. As for what role Kato played in the trilogy, he began work on the first Ninja Gaiden as both a concept artist and as well as a digital artist, including backgrounds and enemy designs for the gameplay bits, and even doing pixel art for the cinematic cutscenes. It's the latter where his style truly came to life, especially with designs of the main villains such as Ashtar and Jaquio? Hold on a sec. Oh, Jaquio. Okay. His heavy use of dark shading as well as the grotesquely organic look of the demonic adversaries in the games certainly left an impression on me, especially in the case of Ninja Gaiden 2, where originally I thought that Jaquio had come back as a giant spider with a human face attached to him. It really spooked me as a kid. Speaking of Ninja Gaiden 2, that's where Kato was allowed to write the game's story as well as continue providing artwork, and by the third game he moved up yet again as gameplay director. By the time he finished his tenure at Tecmo, he managed to shape and influence one of the most solid video game trilogies of all time. He also revisited the series in 2012 with the third game in the reboot series, but
you mustn't ask people things like that. Oh, what am I gonna do with you?
Well, look, nobody's perfect. In any event, seeing how many hats Kato wore while working on Ninja Gaiden goes a long way to illustrate just how much influence and creativity he can bring to a project. With Square and Chrono Trigger, Kato put just as much work into the game's core story elements, setting, and even its characters. He even had his own sketched out designs for how he conceived the original cast. And then let me tell you, it's quite a difference from the more familiar yet also formulaic designs by Akira Toriyama. During one meeting in the planning stage of development, someone made a joke about killing off the main character Chrono, which resulted in a hearty laugh from everyone in the room, except Kato, because he took that very seriously. The point to all this is that, at least when it comes to Square, a game isn't shaped entirely by just the director or producer. Just about anybody can come in and offer their own ideas and input, even if they weren't originally part of the development team. And considering what a monumental project Final Fantasy VII was at the time, and boy is that putting it mildly, the game's setting was conceived in all sorts of different ways. In the early stages, the game was going to take place in modern-day New York, featuring a detective as the main character as they investigate a string of murders as well as a supernatural adversary. Hey, that sounds just like... There were also plans to include an evil sorceress named Idea as the main villain. Oh wait, so that's where that came from. And even before all that, there was a pitch by a completely separate team where the game was going to take place in a dystopian world where characters would pilot giant robots while unearthing the dark plot of a religious organization. We are all Final Fantasy VII. Masato Kato came in during the later stages of development, by which point the game's setting and characters had shaped into the FF7 we all know. His job was to fill in dialogue for a certain character who had been given a more substantial role than what was originally intended. Wait, what? Turns out that at one point in development, Tifa was going to have roughly the same role as she did in the final game, the owner of the bar Seventh Heaven, which was serving as a secret base of the Avalanche group. The big difference, at least according to an early design document, is that she wouldn't actually take part in Avalanche's missions, instead staying behind the bar while cheering the group on in a more emotionally supportive capacity. In other words, an NPC. Or at least that's the conclusion that I came to upon reading this. We don't actually know that at any point she was actually going to join the party, but this does lead me to speculate a little bit. Take this next part as my own personal theory, but assuming that Tifa wasn't an actual party member, and that Seventh Heaven would have been a recurring headquarters for Cloud and the others to keep returning to, at least until it got murder sandwiched like the rest of Sector 7, it's not hard to imagine that the character's original role was to serve as an attractive NPC to keep encouraging Cloud, and by extension the player, as they progressed in the game. As often as it does get debated, it is clear that Tifa's design was meant to evoke a degree of sex appeal, and if we look forward in time to similarly sexualized NPCs who would serve a similar function in other games, yeah, it's pretty easy to believe that Tifa was just one male gaze away from being the prototype Cindy. Fortunately, she managed to avoid that fate, as the decision soon came to make her an actual party member with the group, and all it took was the decision to kill off Aerith in the story. No, yeah, you know? When the team had decided to kill Aerith off, it was a mandate that another female character would be ready to take up the mantle as the main heroine for the story. This is what led to Tifa now being established as part of the core cast, and cemented her role as the primary heroine of Final Fantasy VII. Totally worth it. Once this decision was made, Masato Kato was asked to come in to flesh out Tifa's dialogue in key scenes later in the game. While we don't know the exact amount of Kato's involvement, we do know that he was fully responsible for writing two of the most iconic moments involving Tifa and Cloud in Disc 2, the journey into Cloud's subconsciousness through the livestream, and the conversation between the two characters underneath the Highwind prior to their final encounter with Sephiroth. Now, I'm sure a good number of you have read or engaged in the decades-long debate among fans regarding the subtext of this scene and what it means for Cloud and Tifa's relationship. You've got one group who will say that the two characters spent the night together in an intimate way, while another side insists that it was more of a bittersweet conversation resulting in a permanent friend zoning. Turns out, you're both right. Depending on how much you've developed the affinity between Tifa and Cloud up to this point using the game's affinity system, the conversation between the two characters can expand into a lengthier and ultimately more romantic outcome. As for the more suggestive outcome, it should be noted that Kato originally planned for the scene to be a bit more risk, with the fade to black leading to the two characters awkwardly stepping out of the chocobo stables inside the Highwind, one after the other. Regardless of which of the romantic pairings you hold as sacred, and speaking out of my own personal bias as part of the Klati fanbase, I still personally maintain that this scene is bar none my favorite romantic moment in the entire Final Fantasy franchise. Sure, I'll admit that I was frustrated that we didn't get a more definitive visual outcome, i.e. a kiss or that sort of thing. But in retrospect, I've come to really appreciate the nuance of this scene in how it depicts a more non-traditional romantic relationship. Here are two characters at the tail end of their journey, having endured many hardships and given just one night to express their feelings, only to lack the confidence to confess them. Even though FF7's visuals, once considered the next big breakthrough in console graphics, haven't aged too well, you still have to admire how the team managed to convey a variety of emotions through the Popeye-armed polygons. You've got Cloud showing signs of self-loathing loathing as he lacks the courage to outright state how he feels about Tifa, to which then Tifa displays a slight bit of embarrassment over her more direct proposition, to which we then see the realization slowly hitting Cloud as the metaphorical light bulb pops up above his spiky head. Despite having a TV-friendly fade to black, the realization that the two main characters of the story chose to give in to their baser instincts with literally no time left to iron out their own personal demons really felt like the most mature moment in the entire game. Well, mostly mature. This is exactly what Kato was aiming for when he wrote this scene. He later regretted that he did not confide with his fellow team members first when writing this dialogue, but I really feel he made the right decision here. I can empathize with the difficulty of expressing one's feelings, even with the people you care for the most, whether due to social anxiety or personal trauma, something both characters have in spades. It makes me continue to root for them to reach a happy ending even after the game's official ending, and I am both happy and frustrated that this awkward relationship continued in Advent Children. It's pretty much the main reason I'm still waiting for that follow-up to the sequel tease from Dirge's Cerberus. Even though Masato Kato is no longer with Square, he still works with them on occasion as a freelance writer, which is the reason I would personally love it if he did return to Final Fantasy VII's world by working on the remake, even if much of the characterization and dialogue of the original game should transfer over without much deviation. At least that's what everyone is praying for. Kato's creativity and writing could still come in handy in the project. After all, it was his contribution as a writer with a penchant for more mature storytelling that helped shape a minor character that may have been nothing more than eye candy for the player into one of the most iconic heroines of all time. For such a significant contribution that helped shape the legacy of Final Fantasy VII, as well as one of my all-time favorite characters in the franchise, I truly believe that Masato Kato deserves more recognition as an unsung hero of Final Fantasy VII.